So it is my pleasure to introduce our final speaker of our seminar series, which is Dr. Darryl Gibb. Darryl grew up in a mixed farm in southern Alberta and pursued an education in animal science at Utah State and University of Nebraska. He has done nutrition work in Canada for over 25 years and has experience both in on-farm and formal research settings. Through his work, he is focused on energy availability of ingredients and the impact on performance, digestive health, and economics of beef production. He has invested some of his knowledge in feedlot nutrition and management software that is now used and sold into the beef industry. Darryl currently leads the beef division of Gowans Feed Consulting, where he focuses on nutrition, management, and technology opportunities that help enhance profitability of beef production. So with that, Darryl, thanks for joining us, and I'm happy to turn over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in the Ontario Beef Symposium. I wish that we were all in the same room and there could be more of a discussion and I could get to meet and know some Ontario beef producers and extension people. I have toured some Ontario feedlots, and back when there was some corn being fed in Alberta, or lots of corn being fed in Alberta, some producers and myself went down to Ontario and toured some Ontario yards to see if we could learn something from the Ontario producers on feeding corn. Also traveled with Matt Walpole to a few Ontario yards. Maybe even more so, I wish that all of you guys could have been with me yesterday when I went to a client's place and talked about some cost of gains expectations. This is a custom feed yard, and they only have one large, well, they aren't a large yard, about 3,500 head, but a large finishing yard, placed cattle there, and was quite disappointed at some costs, their cost of gain. And since those cattle have sold, they've filled the feedlot up again, and these cattle owners expect them to finish the cattle, taking them from about 600 pounds up to close to 1,700 pounds for $1.14 per pound. And yeah, that's a good way to go broke if you plan on committing to those type of margins. Anyway, through our discussion with this feedlot yesterday, they described how they were told the cattle were going to get lifted in September. So they planned their implant program accordingly, ended up not going out for 3 months later. They suffered over 1% death loss over that last 3 months. A lot of death loss was just sudden death. There was some bloats. There were some worn out cattle, and they were taken to, like I say, average of close to 1,700 pounds. And so, yeah, in my opinion, the cattle owner doesn't understand real clearly on some changes that occur, especially at the tail end of the feeding period, on live and carcass performance. So he sells carcasses, but he expects commitments on live performance. So some of a good chunk of my discussion I want to go through today is not going to be classical nutrition information, but more about things that we should consider as we take cattle and we are approaching market weight, and some yeah, just like I say, changes in carcass traits and carcass cost of gain. And I am the first to admit that I pulled a fair bit of information from people that I think are authorities on the topic. I've got a lot of respect for Fred Owens. He does a very good job of summarizing information and putting it all together in a paper. And so I've relied on 3 of his summary papers. And also, I know I learned a lot back in the Zilmax days. There are some very good presentations given by Brad Johnson out of Texas Tech, who is kind of a meat scientist. And he documented some carcass changes that occurred with Zilmax. And also Marshall Streeter, who was with Merck. So they were the ones selling the Zilmax. Both of these people were involved with a number of serial slaughter trials. For efficiency's sake, I copied or took some of the slides that Brad Johnson used in presentations for back in the Zilmax days, and also Marshall Streeter. I talked to both of them about it, and they were both totally fine with it. So that's the approach I'm taking. So anyway, with Zilmax came a lot of serial slaughter research. There's been a number of small pen serial slaughter trials. And when I say serial slaughter, that means that finished cattle are harvested at different finish weights. And so that gives us a chance to look at performance and carcass traits at different end weights. And so there had been a number of small pen trials, but now with some pharmaceutical money behind a product where they needed to know information on ending days on feed, they invested a lot of money and captured some very valuable information. I'm assuming that most of the Ontario beef producers sell carcasses and not live cattle. In other words, dressing percent and carcass weight is very important to them. And so, no, I actually ended up on the right slide there. So an important point to consider in my mind is to understand mature weight. And there's a few different definitions of mature weight, but in my mind, the simplest and best is just the point at which protein deposition ends and all subsequent gain is fat. So that doesn't occur suddenly, but just kind of gradually towards the end of the feeding period, there does become a point where essentially no more lean tissue is deposited and it's all fat. There are, or I should say, mature weight is not static. We can change what the mature weight is. If we background cattle for an extended period of time, we can increase the mature weight. So now those cattle, if our end target is a carcass with 28% body fat, if we background them for an extended time period up front, that 28% body fat will now shift from maybe a 1,300 pound animal to a 1,400 pound animal. Likewise, the growth promotants. I mean, Zilmax had an obvious effect. Ractopamine also has an effect, not quite as dramatic, but it also shifts mature weight. Implants also shift mature weight. So when I talk about increasing mature weight, I'm essentially talking about increasing performance and delaying the point where cattle are depositing a lot of fat or depositing less fat. In Fred Owens' summary, he talks about mature weight being achieved at 36% empty body fat. And in his data set, that translated to about a 1,650 pound animal. Okay, another point when we're talking about when to sell cattle, another point that I think is important to understand is carcass transfer. Now this is kind of like dressing percent in that we are looking at how a carcass trait relates to live trait. So dressing percent is carcass weight divided by live weight, but carcass transfer is live average daily gain, or carcass average daily gain divided by live average daily gain. So if cattle are gaining 3 pounds a day on a live animal, only a percentage of that, and it's going to be higher than dressing percent, but only a percentage of that will go to a carcass. And I think in a lot of cases, we underestimate the percentage of live weight that is retained on the carcass. So I think any cattle feeder understands that as we feed cattle longer, the dressing percent increases. And so as I warned you, some of these slides come from Marshall Streeter and Brad Johnson. And so there's some Zilmax numbers here. So let's not get hung up on the Zilmax numbers. In this case, you can see this is serial harvest again. So the first group of cattle were harvested at 136 days on feed. They had a 61% dressing percent. And then you can see that dressing percent basically linearly increases with days on feed. So that's an important consideration when we're considering when first of all, we're selling carcasses. So what is happening at the tail end of the feeding period with carcass weights? So dressing percent increases like that because the carcass continues to grow, but non-carcass components are not growing. So that's obviously increasing dressing percent. The other important point to consider is that intakes do not increase with animal weight. This is a graph I took from a feedlot that I worked with years ago, and it shows kind of classical trends or very typical trends of cattle as they come on feed and go to finish. So started out the first part of April, and as you can see, intakes climbed rapidly until about the end of May. And then they hit a plateau, and yeah, they got to a point where the bunk manager realized they were over delivering. They stabilized, found a plateau. I should point out that this solid line is dry matter intake. This dotted line is intake as a percent of body weight. So dry matter intake was stable through the rest of the feeding period. Right at the tail end, it was starting to drop off, which is pretty common on longer fed cattle. And dry matter intake as a percent of body weight just continually declined right to the end. So that reduction in dry matter intake as a percent of body weight is also contributing to the increased dressing percent, because per pound of body weight, there is less digesta in the animal as time progresses. So something else to consider, when I was talking about carcass transfer, this is another serial slaughter with 3 different slaughter dates. Again, you can see that dressing percent, if we're looking at the control cattle, increased with days on feed. What was it, 66.5 up to 68.4% on the last day. And then they also have the carcass transfer here. So 83% of the carcass at 127 days on feed. And yeah, they didn't see much of a change in carcass transfer with the increasing days on feed. But yeah, very interesting. Look at the Zilmax numbers. 100% of the live gain is actually carcass gain. And I don't want to emphasize Zilmax, but consider that other growth promotants are doing similar, we'll see a similar response, but not to this magnitude. So in other words, we have the opportunity to use some tools and technologies that will, yeah, increase mature weight and delay the point of, or delay fat deposition to allow us to capitalize on the cheaper lean deposition. So when we're calculating cost of gain, Like if we say that live cattle are finishing and selling for $1.50 a pound, it's pretty easy to say, okay, well, predicted cost of gain. If we use some equations, we can determine that maybe our current cost of gain is $1.25. Well, if we can sell a live animal for $1.50, there's still money in feeding those cattle. It's wrong to assume that carcass cost of gain is live gain divided by dressing percent. As we saw from that previous slide, carcass transfer can be well over 75%, 80%. And in today's environment where cattle are fed, 150, 200 pounds heavier than they were just 10 years ago, we don't have good numbers on what those carcass transfer numbers are at those heavy of weights, but I guarantee they're, I would assume they're no less than 80%. So anyway, when we properly calculate that number, you can see if we imagine a live cost of gain of $1.10 at 60% dressing percent, that's $1.83 for carcass cost of gain. But it's not that high. So if we take $1.10, but we use a carcass transfer value of 80%, that's only $1.37 cost of gain on a carcass basis. And when we're selling carcasses for, let's say, $2.50, there is lots of room to feed those cattle longer. And not surprisingly, the cattle feeders have realized, I think the cattle feeders realized before scientists did, that we can just feed cattle longer. Yeah, it takes more energy, they become less efficient, but on a cost of gain basis and cost of production, there's incentives and motivations to take cattle to heavy weights. I think we all realize that as we take cattle towards finish, that fat deposition is increasing, lean deposition is decreasing, and as a result, our cost of gains are increasing. Obviously, as cattle get heavier, they take more energy for maintenance, and that's primary reason that our performance will decline as cattle get heavier. So we occasionally, we will often see increased quality grade with more days on feed, but we consistently and even dramatically see increased yield grades with increasing days on feed. And there can be some heavy discounts for poor yielding cattle. Now I was asking Matt Walpole on some trends seen in Ontario, and he indicated that most feedlots don't sell on a grid. So you might not get penalized, or on paper, you might not get penalized for high yield grade cattle, but I guarantee cattle buyers, if they know of typical trends at your feedlot, they bid accordingly. Okay, this is just another serial slaughter study. And I apologize that this table is not too clear, but you can see the first column is the control cattle. So no Zilmax fed. One group was harvested at 127 days, another about 20 days later, and about another 28 days later again. You can see that rate of gain declines with increasing days on feed. And our feed conversion gets poorer with increasing days on feed. And I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. But, and I should have found a slide or made a slide showing that as dressing percent increases, or as carcass transfer increases, those numbers are not as clear. In other words, carcass rate of gain, carcass feed efficiency, and carcass cost of gain do not decline to the same extent as what it does with live cattle. Another consideration at the end of the feeding period, if we've got lots of incentives and motivations to feed cattle heavier, is obvious overweight discounts. And those can be painful. So you see that, yeah, you got dinged 25 cents a pound or whatever the overweight discount is, and that can be painful. And some people focus too much on that. Yeah, you do take some overweight discounts, but don't try to avoid 100% of them. Financially, you're better off to have some overweight discounts because 100% of that pen is gaining weight when you put more pounds on, but only a small percent are getting overweight discounts. So yeah, the ideal time you should sell cattle, probably when you're getting about 10%, or anyway, I've seen a number close to 20% overweight discounts is the most profitable time to sell cattle. This is just a slide or a spreadsheet that I use to calculate performance effects, changes in carcass attributes, including dressing percent, and what the economic end result is. And I put this together again back in the Zilmax days, and it's also valuable. You know, some people have made a lot of noise about aggressive implants and reduced quality grade. But yeah, what's the net result to the producer? Can we afford some reductions in quality grade and still maintain an economic advantage? And bottom line is, I'll give you my thoughts from numbers I've crunched. You're typically better off to pursue performance than you are to pursue carcass quality. There is more money in performance than there is in carcass traits, other than carcass pounds, because that's where the big bucks are. So that calculator I just showed you was something that could be used to determine what the cost of gain on a live basis is and a carcass basis. And this is a slide that Marshall Streeter put together that I borrowed. But so this lower cost of gain, and there's a yellow line right here that at this time signified the live sale price on cattle. So where the live sale price intersects this cost of gain curve denotes the ideal time to sell cattle. And so in this example, it was 28 days past the first cereal harvest. So compared to the first cattle harvested, it was more profitable to have fed them about 28 days longer. Now, if those cattle would have been sold on a carcass, again, here's the carcass price, dollars per pound, and here is the carcass cost of gain. And there's a carcass cost of gain. So yeah, it's delayed quite a ways. So you've got quite a bit more incentive to feed cattle longer when you're selling carcasses compared to when you're selling live cattle. In fact, Marshall concluded that cattle sold on the rail should be fed about 25 days longer than cattle sold live. I tried to generate this similar curve using today's feed prices, and basically the same conclusion. If we assume live price is around $1.50 a pound, yeah, we'll never crowd the intersection with cost of gain, either on a live basis or on a carcass basis in a realistic time setting. So yeah, there's an incentive to feed cattle to some heavy weights. Some points that I found interesting when I was reviewing some of Fred Owens' literature pointed out that about 2.5% added fat and also increased protein levels help increase dressing percent. So in my mind, added fat, where you're contributing to increased carcass fat, and a common response to feeding elevated protein is increased intake. So bottom line is I think we're just increasing energy intake with both of those nutrients. As I've already talked about, higher concentrate levels, again, we're getting more energy intake, and we're also decreasing intakes with higher energy levels, so we're decreasing gut fill. And higher protein levels contribute not only to dressing percent, but to marbling score, so quality grade. Another point that I found kind of interesting was that synthesis of fat. So when we're laying down carcass fat, if that energy is actually coming from proteins, so if you are close to a distiller's or you've got cheap distillers grains and you feed lots of distillers grains, a fair bit of the energy in that distillers grains is actually in the form of protein. But converting that protein into fat that can be deposited on the carcass is only about 35% efficient. Whereas if it's from carbohydrate, it's about 65% efficient. But if that energy is coming from fatty acids, or in other words, a fat source, it's 98% efficient. So at the tail end of the feeding period, where a lot of fat is getting deposited, yeah, a fat source can help contribute to some efficiencies. I've never seen research where they try to identify the value of fat specifically just at the tail end of the feeding period. But based on these numbers, it would make sense that there's a little more incentive or more motivation to include some dietary fat late in the feeding period. Fred also documented that it appears that fat deposition, based on his data set that he had compiled, seemed to peak at about 550 grams per day. So just a little more than a pound a day. And so if we are past mature weight, if we're up in that 35% carcass fat, that's the only gain we're going to get is about a pound a day. I think we all, or anyone that has been exposed to some nutrition principles, we all know that fat is considerably more energy dense. So if we're looking at dietary fat like tallow compared to corn or wheat or barley, there's just a lot more energy in a pound of tallow than there is in a starch source or a carbohydrate source. Something that often isn't considered is that protein deposited on a carcass turns over on a regular basis. So there's energy that's got to be expended to degrade that protein and redeposit it, essentially. And so I think, or I don't have it clear in my head, I'm surprised to see cases where carcasses that grade real well or have a high yield grade, their performance is sometimes surprisingly good. In fact, John Breathauer out of Kansas State, in the tail end of his career, did a lot of work with ultrasound. And yeah, he found there was no correlation between average back fat thickness and performance. And he speculated that energy cost of fat deposition isn't that far off of the energetic costs of lean deposition, which is kind of a little different than what some of us learned in the classroom. So just in closing, I think managing cattle at the tail end of the feeding period, we should be taking advantage of some technologies that are available. Active implants are very important. And yeah, some of those aggressive implants really help shift energy away from fat deposition and towards lean deposition. Ractopamine is still available, although utilized a little bit less in Western Canada anyway, just because a lot of cattle get shipped to China and they don't allow it. But anyway, bottom line is take advantage of the tools and technologies that are available to improve your bottom line. Something I do often in the ractopamine diet, so typically fed the last month of the feeding period, is I'll bump fiber levels just a little bit. First of all, to help stimulate declining intakes, but also, yeah, those deads on those heavy cattle are very painful. You just got a lot of money invested in feed. And so, again, I think it's just worth being erring on the side of, or on the conservative side of feeding right at the tail end of the feeding period. Like I say, the feedlot I was talking with yesterday, they had over a 1% death loss on heavy cattle. And that was yeah, very painful for owner and the feeder. So if you know you're going to be feeding cattle for whatever 240, 250 days on feed, how fast you get them onto feed becomes less important, just because it makes up a smaller percentage of the total feeding period. And so, yeah, if you know the cattle are going to be on feed for a long time, I wouldn't try to break any records on how fast you get them up onto feed. I mean, I think it's still important to get them onto feed fairly quickly, because it does help performance. But I wouldn't, like I say, try to win any races. So anyway, I think those are some of the most important considerations on finishing cattle, is the end point. And yeah, trying to manage the fat deposition and try to increase lean deposition for cost-effective gains. And yeah, thanks for the invitation to attend and talk. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Darryl, for your presentation and a lot of good insights there. Can you comment on some of the trends with that increasing carcass size? Do you think that's going to continue, and up to maybe what point?
Yeah, that's a good point, Katie. And I don't pretend to have a crystal ball, but I think, yeah, I think if there's money in it, people will continue to do it. And so we've seen heavy carcass weights increase. Most people nowadays, I think it's 1,050 weight before they start getting heavy discounts. And yeah, that envelope will get pushed. And I think there will be a point that heavyweight discounts will control end weight on cattle. So.
Okay. Another question here is, certainly we're seeing more and more dairy producers and dairy crossbred cattle. Maybe some comment on maybe beef dairy crosses, and how you see Holsteins or dairy cross animals finishing out and kind of fitting in with this heavier weight question, or should they be marketed maybe on a different scale?
Well, no, I'm not aware of how they would benefit from being on a different scale. I mean, you know, those dairy breeds, Holstein specifically, they've got so much frame to them, you can get them pretty darn big. And I haven't, well, when we talk about carcass transfer, Fred Owens talks about some of those big frame Holsteins that come in. He's seen carcass transfer that pushes 100%. And so, yeah, Katie, I'm not aware, or I don't know of a different approach a guy should take with Holsteins. It depends so much on the packer and what their discounts are. I know one guy that feeds a number of Holsteins here in Alberta. He sells to a smaller packing plant, and they have, he gets paid good on a grid. Like those Holsteins will grade very good and yield surprisingly good. I think they're an underestimated source of beef. But this packer has pretty low overweight discounts, and so that kind of shuts them down on when they go out.
Okay. Another question is maybe a comment on the uniformity of animals in late finishing period, and maybe is it worthwhile to sort again in late finishing?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to attempt to tell you the economics of it just because I know there's a cost to sorting. And but there's no question sorting will help you sell more pounds of beef. If you can get put the cattle into groups to a more uniform weight, and there's less variation in carcass weight, you can push those animals to a heavier weight before suffering the overweight discounts. So, and yeah, carcass weight is the largest factor that determines profitability. So, yeah, sorting can increase carcass weights.
Kind of along that same lines is not just sorting, but looking at lot size and pen size in heavier cattle. Any comments regarding that and improving efficiency?
Uh, yeah, lot size, I don't think. Yeah, I can see there being a question on pen density. And no question, you might need 150 square feet per animal at 800 pounds, but yeah, you probably need more than that with the big cattle. But I don't think, well, you Ontario feeders would know this answer better than us Westerners that literally have about 150 square feet per animal on average, and go to Ontario and that's down, I don't know what it is, 50 or less. And but yeah, when they get that congested, yeah, and you're talking 1,600 pounders, you're just not going to fit as many cattle in a pen. So I don't have a documentation, Katie, but it's kind of obvious in crowded pens, like you have in Ontario. You would know that answer better than I would.
Okay. Another question here about how much of an effect do you think breed has or breed type on the ability to push cattle to these higher finishing weights?
Yeah, I definitely think that has an effect. Like limousines, for example, uh, they're just not going to deposit the fat. You're not going to have as much bark on them. And obviously, there's some of those double-muscled cattle that we don't have very many of. They're not going to deposit near as much fat. But yeah, I think that does make a difference. I can't tell you exactly which breed is going to tolerate the longest days on feed or anything like that, but it definitely make a difference just on how much lean they deposit versus fat.
All right, and back to maybe more of a nutrition-based question. So you mentioned a few aspects of maybe adapting the diet towards these heavier cattle. One being maybe pushing a little bit more forage, and the other mentioning maybe increasing fat in the diet. We know that fat can impact rumen health a little bit. How much fat would you maybe recommend in some of these diets, or is a safe amount?
Economics drives so many of those decisions. Right now in Alberta, tallow, for example, is hardly even cost effective. It really isn't. And so as fat source becomes more expensive, there's just a little less incentive to put it in there. At times, like last year, we had a very poor canola harvest, so there was a lot of off-grade canola available, and a number of feedlots were feeding rolled canola, and so they wanted to maximize that. And I know I personally recommended going up to 6 or 7% added fat. Tallow, I've rarely gone over 4% added fat, often down 3 and less. But yeah, if the economics are there, I wouldn't be afraid to break some of the thumb rules that exist because of dairy. Yes, some of those fat, especially the polyunsaturates, will affect fiber digestion. In a finishing diet, that's not a big deal.
Great. So I think that brings us to the end of our program. So thank you again very much, Darryl, for your presentation and certainly giving us some things to think about on timing of marketing some of those cattle.